Hi everyone, I'm Asanka Abeysinghe. Let me share my screen first. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. Yeah, as I introduce myself, I'm Asanka Abeysinghe. I'm the Chief Technology Evangelist at WSO2. So WSO2 is a technology company that we provide technologies on API integration and identity and access management and helping organizations to digitally transform. But today I'm not going to talk about WSO2. If you are interested, then you can use this URL that I have highlighted in my screen to get more information. So today's discussion is about how we can convert architecture into a value stream, because we see there's a mismatch in between business and technology, and people don't really understand the value of architecture. As well as architects, we are struggling to make it more important for the business. So that is going to be the topic. A quick introduction to myself. That I started my career as a C++ programmer, and then when Java came into the picture, I moved into Java, and then provided many solutions based on mobile application development, financial sector, and then got into open source technologies with WSO2, and I was an active participant in Apache Software Foundation, and then moved my career into more customer-facing technical roles, that as a VP of Solutions Architecture, and build a Solutions Architecture team. So with that journey, I introduced a new reference architecture and reference methodology that I will discuss in one of those slides, as well as today I am telling the WSO2 story as the Chief Technology Evangelist. So that's a quick introduction about myself. So this is how we are going to utilize next 45 minutes. Basically, we will get into what is exactly happening in the industry today, and then discuss about the architect or the role of the architect a little bit, and then move to the software architecture and identify the gap or the delta between what exactly the industry is looking at, as well as what we are providing, and identify a model that we can make this strategy into execution, and have a recap at the end. So the first section is about the transformation. So everybody in a transformation these days, and if you talk to CTO, CIO, chief architect, or a developer, they are working on some kind of a transformation project, like a digital transformation project. And if you look at the transformation with pandemic, it has accelerated around 7 years in few months. Like all the digital transformation projects that people are working on got increased. The importance of these projects got increased, and they are heavily working on these projects, because digital is the only channel that you can reach most of these your consumers and employees with the current situation. Like people can buy stuff online, and people can connect working from home from online. So everything has digitized, and digital has become the channel that you can facilitate these capabilities. And with that, there are different kind of business models are available. So it's a very crowded market that you have to work, and with that, like, you will have multiple options that you can select these different business models, and then with that, there are number of best practices have come. And the competitive advantage, to make a competitive advantage in this crowded market, that you have to identify what is the best way to handle this stuff, and then define a proper business model that you can provide value to your stakeholders. And we call this as build versus buy, because you can't buy all the software that you require. You need to build stuff on top of the software that you buy and create products that we will discuss in detail in few other slides during this session. So the design principles that we of these business models that we identified are common. So first thing is organizations are moving into more a decentralized approach, and then organizations are practicing lean agile, and then they are following open source, open communication mechanisms, and everything has become customer centric, that we say inside out. And people are moving to cloud native technologies to utilize cloud as much as possible. And it has become data driven because you need to capture how your consumers are utilizing your applications so you can provide a better experience for them. So these are the design principles that business is looking for and technology organizations to follow. But it is not only the technology, it is based on these three pillars, but any organization should have a proper foundation. The foundation, I would say, is based on the culture and the architecture. So the culture and the architecture creates a foundation, and you have to improve people, process, and technology, those three pillars. Once we improve those three pillars, you will get a proper digital alignment as the result. So this is the transformation that these organizations are looking at. But you can't do this overnight. That's where the maturity model come into the picture, that you have to have a proper maturity model and then see whether you are making any progress in your transformation journey. So this is a maturity model that I defined some time back in 2018, 2018 summer. You can go and read the specification. I'll share the URL at the end of the presentation. So if you look at it, I have divided this into 5 vertical and horizontal layers that you can look at and see whether where your organization currently exists or where your team currently exists, and then have a plan to move to the right of this particular maturity model. We are not expecting everybody to move to the rightmost corner overnight. It's a gradual improvement that you have to do on all these areas that we have highlighted here. It's a iterative move, as I explained. It's not an overnight transition. That iteratively you have to move in this maturity model, plan, implement, improve, review and improve is kind of the iterative model, and then keep on working on that particular model till you reach your target that you want to reach in the maturity model I highlighted above. So that is about the current market outlook and where we are and what are the challenges that we are facing. So let's look at what's the role of the architect. So there are many definitions for the architect. This is something that I learned when I was working in Wicklow Island, that one of the product engineering meetings, I met the first architect that I treating as my role model. It's called Eric Nadelin. So the thing that I learned during that particular meeting, architect should have a number of qualities. First thing is the credibility from the depth and the breadth that he or she should gain by learning the business as well as learning the technology. And then the impact that he or she can make to the system by explaining clearly solutions to a different type of problems that we identify. And then architect has to be a storyteller, and he or she has to be a visual thinker as well as a presenter who can visually explain the concepts very nicely. And then I call this term called PowerPoint architecture. Architect shouldn't be just creating PowerPoint slides. He or she should be able to get in deep into the technical stuff and even do some coding to create prototypes and see and understand the technical depth of the things that he or she is working on. So that is the my learning from this particular incident. So there are a bunch of definitions about the architect. So, but I treat architect as a warrior that who will protect the organization by finding solutions by linking business and technology. So you can treat him as a samurai, or you can treat him as a ninja. So that is how I see one view of the architect. As well as architect provides a guide, because he or she will have solutions for these problems that we see. So they always provide a guide for these problems and help in the organization. Next thing is the architect is the curator, that he will connect all these pieces in a problem as well as in a solution, and make a end package solution for the particular team or the organization. So I treat architect as a curator as well. So without wasting much time, let's jump into what is the architecture. Now we discuss about the architect. So it's good to know what is the architecture as well. So some treat it as a specification, and some treat it as a diagram, because as a consultant, when I walk to many organizations, ask, explain your architecture, they give me a IT diagram. But my definition of the architecture is completely different. It's a value stream generator. Why I claim it as a value stream generator? If you look at this diagram, you will verify that. So it's basically connecting these business strategies and then defining 4 types of main architecture styles: business architecture, information architecture, application architecture, and technology architecture. And then it creates a foundation for execution by connecting IT and different type of business processes, and creates an operation model or a governance model. With that, it will create that foundation of execution for these teams to come and build solutions. Or we call them as 2 pizza teams, autonomous teams, or scrum teams. Those teams will come and execute these projects or products and creates a business outcome. So you can always take feedback and go all the way down to the business strategy, or you can fix the things based on that, the feedback you receive from your end users. And then it is doing another thing, that it is connecting these different layers: the business layer, technology layer, execution layer, so and so forth. So this is how it can help to build a value stream using these concepts. So let's look at the business architecture a bit. So this is basically creating converting the strategies into technical components. Traditionally, a business analyst used to do this exercise, but the things have changed with the digitization. So it's done by a business architect who's a deep technical person, but have a fair understanding about the business as well. So this is an example of a business architecture that you can build. This is for a retail industry that we have taken here. Then the information architecture is about the data, but it's not only the data architecture. Data architecture is part of the overall information architecture. You can categorize the data into different sets, like the raw data, relationship related data, historical data, aggregates, and consumption focused data, and build your information architecture. Then the application architecture is where we spend most of our time as solutions architects or application architects. You can either use the traditional layered architecture, or you can move to a modern, decentralized, or microservice friendly architecture as well. Both can be used based on where you are, where are your team, what's your project goals, as well as the technology stack that you are planning to use. In the technology architecture maps that conceptual application architecture into kind of technologies and describes how you are implementing this particular solution using the technology stack that you have decided. So I took an example. In this example, you can see we are using React and then Node.js to build web applications, and then a bunch of technologies like Spring Boot, Node.js, Nginx, and then some WSO2 technologies that I have put here as well. So it's totally up to you. Based on your technology selection, you can pick the correct technology and map it to the solutions architecture that you have defined earlier. So now we discuss about the architect, we discuss about the architecture, and then we looked at the expectation from the business, from you as an architect, as well as from the architecture that you are building. But there's a mismatch in the industry. So what is this mismatch? So first thing is the strategies and execution that we highlighted in our high-level architecture diagram. It's not that straightforward to convert strategies into execution. So I call it as the messy middle, because you have to go through a lot of stuff, define a proper iterative plan, as well as define the 4 architecture concepts that I explained. So it is not that easy. And the next problem is most of the organizations operate, or the architecture is operated in a layered and centralized way, layers creating gates and then blocking the agility of your team, as well as layers creating a lot of blockers to execute and have a smooth flow. So another thing happening, since most of the organizations, they don't have a proper platform to build these solutions, they are building applications in their own environments. We call them as shadow IT, and managing these shadow IT applications as well as utilizing them is an issue for this organization. And then the architecture, another problem is either it is focusing on brownfield or legacy, or it is focusing on greenfield or the new microservices cloud native. But reality of the organization, you need to deal with brownfield as well as greenfield. So when we are building an architecture, it has to support both greenfield and brownfield. And then there's a disconnectivity we see with the architect, developer, and DevOps. Architect will architect something very nicely, but developer will develop something slightly different, and DevOps engineer will go and deploy some completely different deployment based on the information he or she is having. So there should be a connectivity in between these three. And with all this complexity, people are moving back to waterfall. We call it as agile waterfall or agile, because the teams might follow a Scrum or extreme programming or these type of agile practices, but actual execution will happen in a very waterfall manner due to all these blockers or the gaps that I highlighted earlier. So we need to find a way to overcome this situation. So that is what we are going to discuss during the next section. So that is about the execution and how to find a solution for this. The first thing is, like, you have to go through this exercise of defining the business architecture, information architecture, application architecture, and technology architecture, but don't fell into this waterfall model. Try to be iterative on all these 4 exercises and identify the requirements, do the architecture for the initial iteration that you required, not to the end-to-end solution. If you try to do that, then you will eventually fall into that waterfall model. So when defining the business architecture, look at it from the value, like what is the value that you can generate for the organization or the team based on the solution that you are defining. So you get the business strategy and then identify the outcomes, define the objectives and key results, because there should be a way to measure these business outcomes, and then move the concept into consumption in an iterative manner. So that is the best practice that you can do when defining the business architecture. Then the information architecture, a lot of people do a centralized information architecture. That doesn't work with the microservices cloud native type of concepts that we are working on. So try to build a distributed information architecture by dividing your data and then data related processes into many mini processes, more microservices friendly, and then use APIs, events, and streams to connect these data and move data across your systems. Then you can modernize the data architecture using concepts like data mesh or data lakes. So that way your data architecture will become more microservices friendly. Then you have to simplify this architecture. This is a mistake a lot of architects are doing by complicating the architecture. So my advice for that, I use this concept called level 0, level 1, level 2. Start from very basic level 0, as you see in the left side of the screen, a basic block diagram explaining high level components. And then when it goes to the level 1, you expand these different type of layers and then define what are the components that you require. And if you notice these two diagrams, those are completely technology neutral. So do the application architecture completely technology neutral and only define, bring the technology into the picture when you are defining the technology architecture. Then use decentralization, because don't use the layered architecture as much as possible, but there can be situations that you have to stick to layered architecture. If you are using layered, at least go for a segmented approach. Then that way you can easily transform into the decentralized architecture that you are looking at. Then you can still have this separation of concerns even you are practicing a decentralized microservices friendly architecture. So I came up with this concept called the cell-based architecture that I will share the URL at my last slide. That is bringing a concept on top of the domain-driven design, that based on different business domains, how you can define architecture. In this concept, this architect construct that I call it as a cell, and if you can see, it has a local control plane and a local data plane, as well as global control plane and a data plane. That way you can move or make different type of business domains separate and have a proper separation of concerns. So this is kind of an operational model that I have defined to execute this thing, and how you can link the architecture into an overall digital strategy, that the digital steering committee will define different type of strategies based on the business model and market outlook. And then you can have a digital architecture review board to define the 4 architecture styles that I explained earlier. So this is basically completely opposite of the central enterprise architecture practice, that you will give more and more autonomy to different project teams or product teams, and they will do bulk of the architecture, but you will guide by using a reference architecture and a pattern catalog that you define. So once you do that, the operational model looks really nice, that you will get a very nice operational model that autonomous teams will plan, build, test, and run these applications. And then you will define your governance model, and you can see these cubes outside this circle. Utilize all these governance principles, and then have a proper build a pipeline using CI/CD, and have a continuous delivery model in a proper agile fashion. So that is how the execution model works in this particular context. So if you notice this particular diagram carefully, you will see that's a continuous feedback loop coming back to the team from the applications that you deliver. And you will see the DevSecOps as a key component, or the governance component at the top, that will connect to the build pipeline as the policy execution framework for these policies that you define. Then the reference architecture that we discussed earlier will come in handy here as well, that you can see on the right hand side. So the principles that you define there, you will utilize it and then reuse these concepts when you are building the architecture. And the pattern catalog that you identified in the previous exercise, like in this exercise, you define the reference architecture and the pattern catalog. So that will utilize here as well. So the idea of a pattern catalog, you will have reusable patterns. I think you can use standard patterns as well, like enterprise integration patterns, and then many architecture and design patterns. But here we are mainly focusing on what are the valid patterns for your organization, because you can't use everything, and then if there's no standard defined, then it's going to be really hard to maintain these different way of building solutions. So have a catalog of patterns that define exactly what you want. As an example, if you are planning to use an event-driven architecture, how we are going to use it, and what are the standards that you are planning to use, how is your topic hierarchy, and then how the recovery happen in the event-driven architecture, and when you are planning to use event-driven. And another example is request response, like when you are planning to use a request response, and how we are going to do the north to south communication. Are you planning to use HTTPS? And then if you are using HTTP, on top of that, are you planning to use GraphQL? Like that, you will define those standards. And then if you are planning to do east to west communication, how you are planning to do that? Are you planning to use gRPC? And then if you are using gRPC, what kind of an implementation of gRPC you are planning to use? Like that, you catalog it and define it. One thing to keep it in your mind, the pattern catalog can change because technology is changing as well as your business requirements are changing. With those changes, you should be able to update this pattern catalog, version it, and when you are building a solutions architecture or application architecture, you can tell, I am referring this particular version of this pattern in implementation of this particular solution, so that you have a proper reference. And when you are re-architecting a specific application, you exactly know what's the pattern you used, and then you know the new pattern you are planning to use. Then the next cube that you see is the agile principles, that you will pick the correct agile principles. I'll tell you an example. So in agile practice, we used to follow stand-up meetings, but the way the stand-up meetings are planned is completely not agile, because that is how you start the day. We are not sure the entire team members can participate for that, as well as most of these stand-up meetings conducted by the Scrum Master, and sometimes the developers and test engineers, they might not get a chance to contribute to these particular discussions. So like that, you had to define what are you going to pick from these agile principles, and use the relevant principles that will apply for your team and the organization is the key. Then if we come to the blocks we have on the left hand side, continuous integration is key, continuous deployment is key, and it will connect to your build pipelines, and it will allow you to run these automated tests continuously without any issue. Then the version control is key, especially when it comes to a decentralized architecture. You have to version your components, you have to version your the component boundaries or the domains, and each and every shared libraries you have to version control as well. It can be a Docker, a script for a creating a Docker file, or it can be a component that you are planning to reuse across different groups as well. So the version controlling is key. And once you have this proper build pipeline, you will see a continuous delivery, and the application will start getting moving to your internal consumers or your external consumers without an issue. And once you get the feedback, you will go through that same set of exercises and release a new version of your application. So moving to the next slide. So we discussed some really good best practices, but there are more that we can add to our portfolio. First thing is like following the domain-driven design. As I explained, we call them as cells, and increase the programmability, because we discussed about the automation. Without having programmability, it's really hard to have a proper automation. And I call this through agility, through programmability as well. Like once you have a proper programmability, it's really easy to be properly agile. And you can become composable by exposing your business capabilities as APIs. And having an inside-out approach that basically give more priority for your consumers or the customers is the key when you are designing these architecture principles. And next thing is about the project to product mindset. A lot of organizations operate in the traditional way of having a fixed budget and define a project with the end time. But you can't be properly agile with that approach, and you can't have an iterative approach with that as well. So having a product mindset will help you to be properly iterative and ask the business to fund for the value stream, not for the projects. It's very important. And then since we need to utilize the cloud and cloud technologies, you have to design on the cloud for the cloud. So that is another best architecture principle that we have to follow. It will be a publicly available cloud, or it can be a private cloud that you are planning to utilize. Depend on any cloud technology. It's basically following a proper cloud principles. We call it as cloud native engineering, that you need to follow those principles when building the applications. So we are coming to the end of the discussion as well. So I'm moving to the next slide. So I discussed many architecture principles and then best practices. So what's the contribution that I have done, as well as how you can continue this discussion further, is I'm planning to describe in the contribution section. So the first thing is about the cell-based architecture that I explained. It's a way of defining a proper decentralized architecture, because just writing microservices will not help you to have a scalable and more reliable architecture. As well as the one concept in the cell-based architecture is it connects the architect, developer, and DevOps. So this is a URL. It's a GitHub-based project that I have published this in Markdown and released under Creative Commons 4.0. So feel free to comment, criticize, as well as contribute based on your based on the information that you gather from my specification. And then I authored another one about layered and segmented architecture, because we discussed about avoiding layered architecture, but depend on the situation you are at. It's depend on the your current project as well as the organization standards. You might be still have to stick to the layered architecture. So I have defined it in a way that you can push it to a segmented architecture, and by referring this URL on the screen, you can access that as well. In addition to these two, a way of implementing this, as well as if you can remember the maturity model that I explained, how you move to the right in that maturity model, you need a methodology. So I define this agile methodology, and you can refer that as well. So while working on this exercise, I identified there's a common pattern. I call it as a cellular enterprise, a decentralized enterprise and architecture for the organization, that you can look at it from the people point of view, architecture point of view, developer point of view, DevOps point of view. That's where the cellular enterprise came into the picture. So I wrote an article about that as well. And I'm helping architects to come up with these good concepts, as well as I explained, architects has to be very visual thinker as well as a visual presenter. So I'm working on helping architects to be become a better visual thinkers and then visual presenters by drawing proper technical drawings. So this is where this blog comes, like blog.architect2architect.com. I work with a bunch of other architects and then providing guidance on architecture principles as well as many best practices that we find while working on these projects. So since we have only 9 minutes, we are coming to the end. So if you want to connect with me, these are my contact details. You can email me, and this is my LinkedIn URL, as well as you can follow me on Twitter. So that's how we can connect. And if you have a project, and I'm happy to connect with you and help you, as well as if you have any architecture related questions or need some guidance on best practices, feel free to connect. I'm happy to guide you through this. So with that, since we have around 10 minutes, I would prefer to take questions. There are a few questions that already jumped. So the first question is, why is business architecture so important now? I think it was important earlier as well, but we had a way of defining the business requirements using traditional business analysis process. That's a mistake we did, because most of the business analysis are not that technical savvy. With that, what happened, they just gather the requirement and create a 300, 400 page document. And when the project starts, an architect has to redo the requirement gathering. So it's a kind of a waste of time of both sides. So that's where the new role, the business architect, will help a lot. A technical savvy person who's having the business knowledge will do that exercise and define and connect the business strategy into architecture, and he or she will continuously work on the project, defining test cases, use acceptance test cases, and work across the project and be part of the project, not a passenger like earlier model that we used to follow in the waterfall method. So and then again, the generating value is the key component of the architecture. That's why the business architecture has become more important these days as well. And there's another question about what are the largest barriers to the digital transformation? I think if you look at the statistics, it's around only 30% projects are successful at the moment, and 70% projects are failing. So the main problem from my experience is the messy middle that I explained in one of my slides, that the organizations are struggling to convert strategies into execution, as well as execute in a true agile manner. Because of this traditional way of working, as well as how the teams are organized, the projects are fallen into waterfall method, even they are following agile principle. So if you carefully look at and look a Gantt chart or a project plan a Scrum Master has done, you will see it is still waterfall. You might have different build trains. That is the argument most of these teams are providing, but the project operates in a very waterfall manner, and you will have a release cycles in more than 3 to 4 months, and sometimes after an year. So I think that is another reason. And there are a bunch of other reasons, like the skill gap, because organizations are struggling to find the correct skill set from the development, DevOps, as well as the architecture point of view, because the cloud native landscape is very large today, and things are really complicated. As an example, like running a test Kubernetes cluster is really easy, but running and managing a production-ready Kubernetes cluster is very complicated. You need that particular skill set. So organizations are struggling to find the skill set as well as retain that particular skills as well. So that is another reason for the failure of these digital transformation projects. Those are the two questions flow so far, and I believe I answered them correctly. So there are around 4 to 5 minutes remain, and if you have more questions, I'm happy to answer them. I think we discussed a lot of content, and I think the key point here is the links that I have provided here. So these will provide more detailed information on various areas that I discussed during the session. So this is going to be a good reference for you to follow some of these key concepts that I explained. Especially the cell architecture, layered architecture, as well as agile methodology. And you can subscribe to the blog as well, because we write very frequently on different topics. And we started writing about the business architecture as well, since it's a new topic for most of the organizations, but we identified it as a very important topic for these organizations as well. And I'll put my contacts back again, like if you want to connect, you can connect me with LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm active on Twitter as well. And I'll try to respond as quickly as possible when you ask a question there. It's very early morning for me. I'm based in California, west coast of the United States. It's 4:57 a.m. At the moment. And I think this is the first day of the conference, and I believe you will enjoy the rest of the conference and the sessions. And I'm hoping to join with you next year as well. And I'm speaking in a few other conferences in the same area, the DevOps Pro and Dev Days as well. So if you are joining those conferences, I'm planning to discuss different topics about programmability and agility is one topic that I'm planning to discuss. And then there's a detailed session about the cell-based architecture, about how you can build cloud native applications in one of those conferences as well. So feel free to join, and happy to discuss these topics in detail on those conferences as well. So we are coming to the end. I think there are no other questions, so we can conclude the session. I assume this is very helpful, and you will learn something new. So you can follow the references as well as I repeated earlier, and connect for further information. And have a good conference and enjoy the day. Thanks again.